What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review the new animated movie Superman Man of Tomorrow, which actually came out at midnight last night at the end of the giant DC fandom event where we had all kinds of news and trailers related to anything and everything going on in the world of video games, comics, animation, TV, movies, etc. Long story short, it's been an incredibly good 24 hours to be a fan of the DC library of characters, and I had no idea that this movie is about to come out. I just stumbled across the news and some random article about DC fandom. So I downloaded the movie at midnight, and guess what? It's pretty goddamn good. For people who don't know, this is the first animated movie in a brand new slate or a brand new continuity for the DC characters in animation. Earlier this year, Warner Brothers Animation unleashed Apocalypse War, which completely, totally eradicated all the existing storylines in a really satisfying way. The movie was absolutely fantastic. And what's really interesting about Superman Man of Tomorrow, not only is it a really strong first entry in this new continuity, it also has a brand new animation style that I haven't really seen in any previous Warner Brothers animated movies. And while I was initially reluctant when I saw this new style in the trailer, by the end of this movie, I 100% became a believer. But just to give you an idea of some of the people involved, it was directed by Chris Palmer, whose only previous directing credits were on Voltron Legendary Defender. It says here he directed about 16 episodes. I've never seen it, but he also worked in the art department and animation departments on things like Young Justice and How to Train Your Dragon. But I have to admit that I'm rapidly becoming a fan of his approach to animation. But I should also give a shout out to writer Tim Sheridan, who is a DC veteran at this point. He wrote Reign of the Supermen, which I thought was a very solid animated movie from Warner Brothers Animation last year. And more importantly, he's writing the upcoming Masters of the Universe Revelation TV miniseries. And having now digested more of his work with Man of Tomorrow, my anticipation for that Masters of the Universe animated series is starting to rise. And this movie also features some really interesting voice talent. We've got the great Zachary Quinto, Sylar aka Spock himself, playing Lex Luthor. And there have been so many extraordinary actors who have brought Lex to life over the years, from Gene Hackman in the late 70s up through Clancy Brown. But I have to admit, Zachary Quinto's interpretation of the character was spot on. But we've also got the unimaginably sexy Alexandra Daddario playing Lois Lane, and I didn't even realize it was her until the end of the movie, but she absolutely, completely knocked it out of the park. But I imagine that a lot of superhero fans and comic book fans out there are probably thinking to themselves, do I really need to see yet another origin story for Superman, both in feature films and in television and in animation and on the page? We've all seen, digested, read, experienced Superman's origin story a million times over, but the miracle of this movie is that somehow they managed to make it feel fresh while at the same time remaining very true to the roots of the character. If you're going to do Superman's origins, you have to get two things right. You got to get Smallville right, and you got to get Metropolis right. And if those two atmospheres and locations don't feel true to the character, people are just going to reject your story outright. But Jonathan and Martha Kent, they were absolutely salt of the earth. Their characters embrace all the values that we associate with both Smallville as well as with the Kent family. And I really like the portrayal of Metropolis. Metropolis is incredibly futuristic. It's incredibly gorgeous. And what's fun about this is that we get to see Clark Kent as a very young man while he's still working as an intern, and he's trying to figure out how best to put his powers to use, because even if he wants to maintain a low profile, things are starting to happen in Metropolis where, whether he likes it or not, he's going to have to play a role in resolving these problems. Because the big debate at the core of this movie is whether or not aliens exist and what should be done about them. And Lex Luthor is determined to lead the charge on that front, but early on disaster strikes when he's testing a rocket. It immediately changes trajectory and is coming back towards Metropolis, so of course Clark Kent has to step in and save the day. But what's cool about this origin story is that Clark Kent, aka Kal-El, he's not the only alien in the movie. We have both John Jones, aka the Martian Manhunter, and we also have Lobo. And what never even really occurred to me until they really clarified it in this movie is that Lobo, Martian Manhunter, and Kal-El, they all have a lot in common because they're all the last of their species from their planet. And granted, the way they became the last member of their species is different for all of them. Lobo likes to boast and brag about the fact that the reason he's the last is because he murdered his entire planet. In this movie, he claims he's only kidding, but in the comics, Lobo absolutely did commit genocide on his planet. He is the last of his kind. And if you're not familiar with the character of Lobo, he was huge in the early 90s. Basically, comics in the early 90s embraced a new kind of superhero where suddenly characters like Cable and Punisher and Lobo and Wolverine, basically they had a lot of guns and a lot of weapons, like characters like Deadpool. Suddenly in the early to mid 90s, those characters were absolutely in vogue, and Lobo was a huge part of that. and his look and his way of expressing himself hasn't really changed at all in the 30-year interim. But in the context of this movie, he is a bounty hunter, and he's a special kind of bounty hunter because he only looks for people who are the last of their kind, which naturally brings him to Earth. So suddenly Clark Kent finds himself having to roll up his sleeves and do battle with this total madman. But there's an unintended side effect of their battle, which leads to a really fresh new take on the character Parasite. Now, I've been a massive fan of Parasite going all the way back to when there's this really cool crossover between Spider-Man and Superman. It was kind of an Elseworld scenario, but the bad guys were Parasite and Dr. Doom. And as a little kid, Parasite just always totally freaked me out. The idea that there's this creature who can drain anything dry, whether it's a person or a power source or whatever. And of course, Superman represents the best possible battery that he can suck on the planet. But I do want to call attention to some of the ingredients that I really enjoyed. First and foremost, I love this new animation style. It's incredibly fluid. It's just a pleasure to look at. And sometimes straight-to-video animation can be a little herky-jerky, especially during fight scenes. But I hope that Warner Brothers Animation sticks with this style, at least for a couple of years, because I feel like whenever you're rebooting a library of characters with a fresh continuity, having a unique animation style will really help set apart this new corner of the DC animated universe and help people keep it separate in their minds from some of the previous iterations of these characters. And I hope that these animated movies will continue to embrace the adult humor, the adult content, and some really adult dramatic situations as well. I mean, there's some superficial kind of fun things, like at one point, Superman's flying back through the atmosphere, and because he's flying at such speed, his regular civilian clothes burn off. So yes, if you've ever dreamed of seeing Superman naked, now is your moment to see him in all of his naked glory. Or just the way that Lobo expresses himself. He says shit at every available opportunity. But there's one scene that I think is going to absolutely traumatize some little kids if any parents happen to throw this in without really thinking about it first. But I don't want to give too much away, but there's this pump fake where a very important character dies, and the way they're just screaming in horror and agony as they die, I just couldn't believe how impactful it was. I was like, oh my God, like this is like upsetting me, and I'm a weird, cynical old bastard. But it really caught me off guard because the animation style is very beautiful. It's almost kind of wholesome and innocent in a lot of ways. And so the adult content really caught me off guard, but in a really good way. But in terms of negatives, I guess one of the big risks is that anytime you reset continuity, it's hard to get people emotionally invested again. It's hard to get people to rev up their engines. I'm not a big fan of company-wide reboots in Marvel Comics or in DC Comics. I feel like it's done way too often because longtime viewers and readers, they get very attached to certain stories, and they want those stories to remain part of canon. And when you come along and just wash it all away, there are a lot of people out there who will resent that. So if you've loved or enjoyed any previous iteration of the DC characters in animation, it can be frustrating when they say, you know what, we're starting fresh. I've always preferred the approach of Grant Morrison, where in the comics he basically says, no matter how strange or weird or bad or good any previous iteration of the character has been, he just embraces it and makes it part of official continuity. That's the approach that I like. But this is a very strong early statement for this new direction. And there's a brief moment where they mention Batman in a newspaper, so I'll be very curious to see how they tackle Batman moving forward. And they definitely need to keep director Chris Palmer and writer Tim Sheridan on the payroll. I will watch any show or movie that either of them are associated with moving forward. And I definitely want to see Zachary Quinto and Alexandra Daddario return as Lex and Lois. Darren Criss is new to me, but I thought he was a pretty good Superman. But my final takeaway, my final bit of praise that I want to offer to this movie is that finally Martian Manhunter is getting some love. I feel like in the Bruce Timm Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, Martian Manhunter got tons of love back then, but that was a long time ago. That was like 15 years at this point. But this actor, Ike Amati, did a brilliant job of fleshing out the character, bringing him into life. And I love how this movie leaned into him as a detective. He's basically a detective with telepathic powers who every once in a while can kind of hulk out, go full Martian mode, and become the shape-shifting badass who's afraid of fire that we all know and love. But Martian Manhunter, he's a founding member of the Justice League. He was in that very first issue of The Brave and the Bold where he and Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Flash, and Aquaman took on Star the Conqueror. And he should be a massive pop culture icon. Because I feel like Green Lantern, Aquaman, Flash, and Wonder Woman, they've been getting a lot of love in the live-action world. And obviously Martian Manhunter has popped up on some TV shows, but it blows my mind that a live-action feature film hasn't put him to use yet. He has such a cool power set. He has such a cool origin story. He's got such a noble air about him. It is a huge, giant missed opportunity that Martian Manhunter hasn't already appeared in 2 or 3 feature films at this point. but at a bare minimum, Superman Man of Tomorrow really gets the character right in my opinion. At any rate, I think I've shared all I want to share at this point, so I hope you enjoyed this reaction and review. Please consider subscribing to my channel, hitting that notification bell, and if you want to talk more about comics or animation or whatever, you can hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrex. But I can't thank you enough for watching my video. I really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great upcoming week, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.